So in today's webinar, we will be working through how hours tracking functions within CERVIS and the different tools that you can use to estimate or accurately track the hours that your volunteers are contributing. We'll begin with a few definitions related to hours and opportunities just to set the table, and then we'll discuss the default stance that CERVIS takes regarding hours tracking. And then we'll proceed into different ways to modify that default stance. We'll cover how to retroactively record activity for volunteers. And lastly, we'll talk about some of the reporting mechanics available both to you and to your volunteers as you're summarizing and reviewing contributions. So first off, it's important to define in CERVIS what we're talking about when we're discussing hours and kind of the different opportunity types that are available for recording hours. Now, for most organizations and kind of the default stance in CERVIS, hours typically represent the physical amount of time that volunteers have spent serving with you as an organization. However, the moniker that we use is credit hours, which might mean that you can lean into different scenarios where perhaps the length of the shift doesn't necessarily correlate with how many credit hours someone is receiving. So bear that in mind if you have kind of a different scenario. Hours in CERVIS doesn't necessarily correlate directly to start and end times of shifts, although that's typically the case. So as we're getting into kind of recording hours, it's important to note that there are three types of opportunities available in the system by default. We have what we call normal events, time slot events, and service projects. There is a third or fourth type of opportunity called a paid event if you need to accept payments before a volunteer can register for a shift. If you have questions about that, let us know, but we're going to focus on these three here primarily today. Now, all of the event types really carry with them the concept that you are creating shifts. And with that, you will also be creating default credit hours. So again, typically this matches or aligns with the length of the shift. So if this shift is 3 hours long based on the start and end time, you would put in 3 credit hours here. If it's 3.5 hours long, we're going to put in 3.5. This is always recorded in hours, not in minutes. So you want to be sure about that kind of distinction, right? Just as another simple example, if we're doing 3 hours and 45 minutes, we would do 3.75, right? So this is generally how kind of these default hours are set up for a normal event, or likewise for a time slot event, which allows you to create multiple shifts within a singular event. These also have default credit hours, and you can define those in a very similar manner. Just go through and define the length of the event. Now with events, CERVIS normally assumes that a volunteer attended the event for its full duration and will give volunteers the credit hours that you have listed here by default. Now, there are lots of ways to override that. We're going to get into that, especially like tracking hours directly through the sign-in console or manually modifying hours. Those are things that you always have the capacity to do. But it's important to note that this is the default stance. CERVIS assumes that a volunteer attended their shift for the full duration and they're going to receive that credit unless you do something to modify that or the volunteer does something to modify that, like using the sign-in console or before the shift even starts, canceling that kind of registration. So that's kind of important to note. Now, I do want to mention something here. You can enter a default credit hours of 0. Which means that a volunteer is not going to get any credit for this unless they at least sign in for their shift. So this would require kind of using the sign-in console. We'll get into this caveat more in a little bit, but that is something that you can do if, for example, you do not want volunteers to receive credit hours by default. All right, so we're going to dig more into the sign-in console and modifying those hours in a minute. Before we get into that, I want to point out the last type of opportunity, service projects. And we have a webinar on service projects altogether. So if you want to deep dive this further, you're more than welcome to enjoy that. But service projects are the idea that we're creating a long form activity where volunteers are recording their hours as they serve rather than signing up for specific shifts like what we would see in the event types. So with a service project, you would generally define how a volunteer is allowed to log their hours. So you can say volunteers can record hours online, which just means that they are retroactively self-reporting. So they're saying, yesterday I worked on this for 2.5 hours. Here's what I did. Or today I worked on this for 3 hours. Here's what I did. So they're just going online and recording those hours directly. And I'll show you that in a moment. Or they're using the sign-in console. So that would be, again, same kind of scenario. They sign in when they arrive, sign out when they leave. That will record how long they were there. And of course, you can enable both of those options. And you always have the ability as an admin to override those things or pump in your own hours kind of as needed. Now, one thing I want to point out for service projects is we don't get a default number of credit hours because it's not a shift per se, but you can define a default number of hours when using the kiosk. So under advanced options, when you are creating a service project, there's a setting that says default kiosk credit hours. So you can go in here and say, well, normally if people are working on this project, they're contributing 1.5 hours. So if someone neglects to sign out, then I want them to just receive 1.5 credit hours. This is not a cap. It does not function as such. It only gets deployed in the scenario where a volunteer signs in for their shift, but then they neglect to sign out. Whether they forgot to or you're just not asking people to sign out is immaterial. But this gets triggered at the end of the evening when a volunteer is still signed in for this shift. I believe it's actually at midnight. The system will just check, hey, is this person still signed in? If they are, let's kind of end that and give them 1.5 credit hours. So again, it's not a cap. If somebody signs in at 1 p.m. and they sign out at 4 p.m., they're still going to get 3 hours, even though this default is set to 1.5. Okay, so again, that's kind of more specifically for service projects. For your events, obviously every shift you create a default number of credit hours. And just to reiterate again, the system will assume that people are attending for that full duration and give them those hours unless something happens to modify that. Okay, so that's kind of a couple definitions here. Let's actually get into the ways to modify hours primarily through the sign-in console, but then we'll also look at this from the back end as you're working on volunteer accounts, and then with service projects, how volunteers can record hours directly. So we're going to start with the sign-in console here. Now, if you want to deep dive into all the functionality related to the sign-in console, again, we have another webinar where you can run through that material. What we're going to focus on today is using the sign-in console to record and modify those hours and also identifying things like no-shows. So when the sign-in console is open, and there are a couple different ways to do this, you can log in and click on sign-in console or kiosk, or you can get a direct link from our customer support team. But when the sign-in console is open and a volunteer shows up for their shift, they search for their name, they go through verify, and then they can click sign in. Now I already signed in this morning. So now if I'm coming back to sign out, I would click on sign out. When I do that, the system is going to record the time between sign in and sign out. And it's going to basically give me hours based on the disparity between those two times. So this does record down to the minute. So it will adjust hours directly based on those two times, regardless what the default credit hours were for that event. The function is the same for service projects. If a volunteer is signing in for a service project, they have to be registered for it, or you have to allow walk-ins with that. But then a volunteer can click on sign in when they get there, come back and sign out when they leave, and that will record exactly how long they were there. Now, again, it's down to the minute. So if we do this right now, we're going to get 0 credit hours because it was within 1 minute, but you get the idea here. So this note is just telling the volunteer what got recorded, but of course you can see that on the back end as well. So from the volunteer's perspective, using the sign-in console, pretty straightforward. And you can use mobile sign-in with the same functionality. Whether you're asking volunteers to scan a QR code you've posted and sign in from there, or if you're having them use the links that are sent directly to them, functionally it's the same thing. And even a volunteer could sign in on a kiosk you have set up and then sign out on their phone, or vice versa. They're all basically doing the same job. And we're going to close the sign-in console here and go back to the admin perspective and look at what we just recorded. So if we move into searching and managing existing opportunities, In here, we can see all of our events, and we'll go down to the one that I just signed in and out from. So if I click into view the registered volunteers for this event, that will pull up a screen that shows the roster. So on this page, I can see everyone who is registered for this event. Now, this event is ongoing at the moment, and we can see pretty quickly who has signed in and who has not based on the presence of different icons here. So if someone did sign in, we see this sort of time card or a stopwatch icon rather. So you can see that that person did sign in. If we mouse over it, it tells you when that person signed in. And of course, if there's no icon like that, this person did not sign in. So maybe they're late. This event's still ongoing. We can show some grace there, but eventually this might lead me to mark this person as a no-show. But we can see what we recorded here through the sign-in console. I can see when someone signed in. On the right-hand side, if someone signed out as well, that gets recorded in these registration notes. So if we mouse over that, I can see the exact dates and times of sign in, sign out. You can also click on that if you need to make adjustments in here or add in other notes. Incidentally, adjusting anything through here will not make any changes to what the volunteer actually can see in their recorded activity. It doesn't adjust how many hours that they're receiving. This is just a note at this point. The hours have already been recorded, and this is not affecting reports, right? So if you actually want to change how many hours this person received, because you actually want to indicate, well, they actually signed in earlier, they just forgot to, and I wanted to go and correct that. Yeah, you could change the time in here, sure, but that's not going to change their hours at all. The hours are contained on the left-hand side. There's a calendar icon here. By default, this icon is blue. Again, that means this person is receiving the default credit hours because remember, Service assumes that they attended. Now, we might be marking Jerry as a no-show later, in which case, of course, he's not going to get credit. But you can see above that, I did sign in and out. Therefore, this calendar icon is gold. And if I, as an admin, want to go and adjust that later, I can click on this icon and make changes through here. All right, so if I want to say this person was actually here for an hour and 45 minutes, we can go and change that contribution, adjust the hours. This is where you are editing how many hours someone gets on an individual basis. Now, again, if they're signing in and out accurately, we don't need to do that. That's irrelevant. They've already signed in and out. The hours are being recorded. This is just a scenario where I need to manually make an adjustment on an individual. If I'm using the sign-in console and people are signing in and out, don't need to do anything like that. If I'm not using the sign-in console and this whole event went long and I want everyone to get extra credit, well, sure, I could click on this calendar for each person. That just might be a little tedious depending on the number of people registered. So what you might do in that scenario is just adjust the event. We could back up, edit this event and say, actually, the event was 12 hours. People stayed really late. We had a lot of good service from that. You can go and adjust the event after the fact, and that will modify how many hours volunteers are receiving as long as they're set to receive the default. Okay, so this is kind of what we're producing by using the sign-in console. Now, a couple more things that you can do with that knowledge. Obviously, on this page, it's fairly straightforward to see who did not sign in. So I could readily select those individuals, and then down at the bottom, I could mark them as a no-show. Right, this is still a relatively manual process because I'm going through and picking those people, but if it's just a couple people, it's not that hard to do. Alternatively, there are a few ways that you can kind of speed up or even automate this process. If we back up a step, so we're going to go back to the main opportunity dashboard. On this page, you can select multiple events. So I might search for a set of events, maybe everything that occurred last week using the advanced search and applying a date range. Or maybe I just want to look at all the things that are ongoing. Depending on how your events are set up, you might want to run a different search here. But I can select multiple events, and then from there, in the drop-down for bulk actions, there is an item here to mark no-shows. And what this will do is it will actually pull a list of every person who did not sign in for a shift that has already occurred. I am not seeing any future registrations in the list here. I'm not seeing anything that's still ongoing. So I mentioned Jerry earlier. He hasn't signed in for that event yet today. That event's still happening. He could just be late. So we don't actually see him on this list yet. Once the event is over, then he would pop up on this list if he didn't sign in. But I can look at this list and then I can kind of quickly vet this and say, actually, I remember Jack being there yesterday or 2 days ago. So I'm going to go ahead and select that and mark him as signed in. Now, of course, that is putting a date and time on the sign in. But in this case, all I really care to do is say that he was there. I don't really care about the time because I'm not adjusting his hours. He's still receiving the default. But the rest of these people, they're all no-shows. I can select them all, click on Mark as No-Show, and that will do two things. It pulls these individuals from the event so that they do not get credit, and then it also adds a no-show note to their profile, which is something that you can search by. If we step over to the volunteer side of the database, if we go into the advanced volunteer search, from here, we can search by participation options, so like how many hours has someone served? We're going to get into some of this more later. But one of the things we can search by in here is, does the volunteer have more than or exactly a certain number of no-shows or cancellations or both? Either in general, we can leave the date range blank, or we can say in a given period. Maybe I want to find all my volunteers who had a no-show last month and send those people a note, or maybe 3 no-shows last month, right? So you can go and enter a number here. I'll say more than 0. So this means at least 1. Anywhere you see things like more than or less than in service, you can supplement a greater than or equal than sign or less than sign. It is not greater than or equal to. So this is more than 0. But if we go ahead and run that search, obviously all those people that I just marked as a no-show get pulled up, and then I can go and use that to send an email or do something else if I need to. Those no-shows are stored as a note on the volunteer profile. So if you need to manipulate that, i.e. remove the no-show, maybe it was an error, you can go in and update someone's profile. And if we scroll down, we can see the notes on their account. So we can see this person was marked as a no-show on this date and time by this admin, and this was the event that they were marked as a no-show on. So you can still see that in here. We can obviously delete this note if we want to, and that would also remove the mark from their profile. Okay, so that's, again, kind of what we're doing with the sign-in console in terms of identifying no-shows, marking no-shows, seeing who was present, adjusting activity automatically. There's one further thing that you can do to kind of automate some of that process, and this is a setting on your events. This is specifically for events, not for service projects. But let's say I'm being very specific about using my sign-in console, and I want to make sure that everybody is signing in at least when they arrive for their events. You can have the system automatically mark no-shows so that you don't have to do that at all. This is a setting on each event. It's not a global setting. So maybe there are certain scenarios where you want to use this. But if you go into update an event, and we scroll down under advanced options, at the very bottom, there's a setting that says automatically mark no-shows. There's a nice little warning here saying, hey, don't do this if you're not sure what you're doing. But basically, if you are using the sign-in console, you're being pretty pedantic about that, then you're making sure that everybody's signing in, then when this setting is turned on, any person who was not signed in for a shift will automatically be marked as a no-show the following day. So there is a buffer on this. They'll be marked as a no-show the next day at 8 p.m. So if they were actually present, you have some space to still sign them in and say, yeah, they were there. But generally, the point of this is so that you can be a little bit more hands-off, right? If somebody neglected to sign in, then they're not going to get credit. So this basically just does the no-show process automatically. But again, on a bit of a delay, it's the following day at 8 p.m. Okay, a couple more ways that we can modify hours that I want to point out to you. Now, I mentioned for service projects, a volunteer might be allowed to just record activity directly. The way that looks for a volunteer is once they've logged into their account, there's a section for recording or updating service project activity. They can enter into that section, select a project that they are already registered for. So this must be something that they are already registered for. And then from there, they can pick a date. And this has to be retroactive. We can't forecast anything through here. So I'd have to say, yesterday or Monday, I came in and I worked for 2.25 hours. I could have some notes about what I did. And then we could just basically record that activity directly. So this is the volunteer just recording their hours as they serve. You can see, I can also see when I signed in and out as a volunteer. And volunteers do have permission to modify some of that stuff if they need to remove things. But only if they added it, not if you added it. In case you're wondering, in this example, I can see a lot of names here. This is because I'm in charge of a group, so I can see what my group members have done. But you can see the entry I just added here. I can see the notes that I added as well. And if I need to remove this, I can go down to the bottom of the page and remove that entry. So from the admin side, when a volunteer does that, you will be able to see those hours, obviously. If we switch back over to the admin perspective and we go into that project, so this was my Reading Mentors project, there's an icon on every service project to log activity. And if we click into this, we can see all of the hours that were recorded. Now this page can contain a lot of information because it's filtering by a date range and it's showing everyone who's in this project and all the hours that they've recorded. But this is sorted by name initially. We could sort by date if we prefer, just by clicking on that calendar or that heading. We can also sort by service hours. Maybe you want to look for like things that are too large, right? Maybe people were signed in for too long or put in too large of a number, things like that. But you can sort by that as well. All of these entries can be adjusted by you, right? So as you're looking at this list, maybe we realize, hey, that shouldn't be 0 hours. That should be 0.5. Right, I could go in and change that as an admin. You can make adjustments in here. We can see the notes that people added. If people use the sign-in console, once again, we see the sign-in time and the sign-out time. So that gets reflected in these entries. And of course, you can remove any of these as well. If you see anything that's an error, you could go and select those entries down at the bottom. You can click to remove the entry. And of course, from this side, you can also directly record activity. So if we scroll back up, if you're trying to retroactively record hours for an individual in a service project, you can just go into that project, select the individual who is registered. If you do not see their name here, that means that they're not registered for this project. So you would need to register them first. But then from there, we can select what day they came in. We can add hours. Incidentally, something worth pointing out, if you are doing large bulk additions of hours, like maybe I wanted to say in the month of May, this person contributed 150 hours. I could go in here and call this a monthly total, something like that. This is something you as an admin have permission to do, but not something that a volunteer could do. A volunteer can't exceed 24 hours in a given day when they're contributing activity. So if we log that though, we can see down here, that entry here. Again, I can adjust this, remove it, make notes on here, whatever we need to do. Okay, there is one other way that I wanted to mention that you as an admin can kind of retroactively contribute hours to volunteers. And actually, sorry, there's two. One is if a volunteer attended an event, but they didn't register for it. Maybe you weren't doing walk-ins through the sign-in console at that event. Maybe they just showed up and you want to add them after the fact. You can always do that. That must be done through the event. So if an event has already occurred and we're trying to record individuals to that event as attendees, you can go back into an event no matter how old it is, and you can go to view the roster and we can look up an individual and register them for that event. So you can always do this after the fact. If you're looking someone up in here and you don't see their name, that means they don't have an account. You could create their profile on the right-hand side, use this add volunteer profile icon, quickly fill out an account. All you really need from the admin side is name, phone, email. I would treat this as a required field in case you want that person logging in, because that's how they do log in. Although you can neglect it if you know they don't have one. But this is, again, someone signed up for an event, or maybe someone just showed up at an event. They didn't register ahead of time, but I'd like to note that they were present at that event. You can always do that. You just need to do that through the opportunity itself, not through the volunteer's profile. So that's one thing to note. And then one other note is maybe you have a scenario where a volunteer did a contribution with you, they participated in something, but it was maybe more of like a pop-up event, wasn't something that already happened, wasn't something that you were necessarily planning on, but I want to give those people credit still. There is something in Service called a quick event, which is essentially a way to just add hours directly to someone's profile through kind of like a pop-up event. So this is actually done through the volunteer database because you'd add it directly to someone's profile. If we go into search and manage volunteer database, we can go to an individual's profile. We can click into manage someone's account. And then up towards the top, there's an option here that says create and register this volunteer for a quick event. And if we select that, this allows us to just add in kind of like a very truncated event. So maybe this was like a pop-up landscaping event or something, right? So I just give it a title, and then from there I can pick when this event was. Maybe it was a couple weekends ago, and it started at 10 a.m. And then we want to identify who the organizer was, basically the point of contact. You could always use yourself here. What interest category does this fall into? And then from there you can select how many credit hours this is worth. So, this is 3.5 hours or whatever it might have been. This is obviously a bare bones amount of information, but it's a way for you to kind of quickly submit and say, hey, this person came in a couple weeks ago for a 3.5 hour event. I want to give them that credit. There's no service project in this context that this makes sense to add to. This is really like a one-off thing. Then this is kind of an easy way to do that. Now you can see up at the top, it says we've created that quick event. We can also click here to add other people in. Maybe a few other people showed up for that event. I can click here and then we're brought to the roster for that event. So same screen we were just kind of looking at. And then we can go in up at the top and search for individuals and add them to this list. Okay, the last thing that we're going to take a look at here today regarding hours is a brief look at some of the reporting functions and really kind of defining some of the major terms as it relates to reporting in Service. So we're going to start off on the admin side, but I do want to mention we're going to look at a report that volunteers can pull themselves as well. So reporting in Service is typically done through report management, although sometimes we need to start a report by running a search. Maybe we only want to look at a specific set of volunteers or a specific set of opportunities. That might define some things within the report that we want to know. If you're doing like a demographics report on a certain age range, you could go and run a search first for that set of volunteers. So use the advanced search, use age options, and say, show me everyone who's 18 and up, right? I want to see what these people contributed in the last year. So you could go and run a search first and then move into reporting. There are many reports here that have this query function, which is basically telling the system, hey, I want to use either the previous search that I just ran or maybe a saved search that I've created. But you can see the default stance here is all volunteers. So we don't always have to start with a search, but sometimes, when you're running a report, you only want to look at a set of volunteers or a certain set of events. So that's kind of relevant in this scenario. Otherwise, most of these reports, when you enter into report management, will use the date range at the top of the page. And then from there, they all have kind of their own selection options. And it really just depends on the hierarchy of the report for you, what your preference is in terms of what is like the highest level of this report, what are the summaries that I'm getting. A very common report that I see run is the interest category report, because it takes the categories that you've created, which are kind of like folders or buckets, that your events get fit into. And then it just tells you, hey, during the last month, you had X amount of hours in this category versus this category. So it kind of breaks out your activity based on what category the event was a part of. Another common one here, there's this yearly participation summary, which sorts by month. This is just going to give you totals on a per month basis, and then also for an entire year. Now this report can be run for like a fiscal year or for a calendar year. You pick the starting month and the starting year, and then it will give you 12 months from that month. Okay, but I want to show just a brief report here. We're going to look at this custom participation report. This one is highly flexible. There's a lot of things you can include in this report if you want like volunteer information in there or event information in there, but I'm going to run this pretty bare bones right now. I want to do a low detail report, so we're just getting a summary per person. We're going to look at year to date so we can see what's happened so far this year, and then we're just going to run this report. So this report's going to give us a total on a per volunteer basis. So let's go and actually open that up here. So this is just a plain spreadsheet. Again, we didn't really choose to include much information in this report because I just wanted these numbers. And I want to talk about what these numbers represent. So you can see I did low detail for this report, which means every row is an individual. And I can see their total registration count and their total hours served. So these numbers are probably what you expect, but just to be clear, registration count is like a turnstile. How many times did this person come through the door? How many shifts did they participate in? How many times did they record hours to a service project? It's all of those things bundled together. So this person, since January 1st, has volunteered with me on 13 different scenarios or situations. And in total, that represents 20.43 hours for this person. So the hours served is what we've kind of been harping on today. How many hours did they physically participate? Or perhaps you're using credit hours to mean something different, and then that'll of course be reflected here. Now, if we scroll down to the bottom of this report, it's going to give us some totals. So we can see the total number of unique volunteers, the total number of opportunities, the registration count, and the total hours. So unique volunteers is what it sounds like. And sometimes the reports in Service don't say unique volunteers, but they'll have volunteers and then an asterisk next to it. This always means the same thing. There are 222 people with accounts in the system that have hours recorded in the date range that I searched for in this report. Right, so that is what this number represents. I can identify 222 people in the system who have their own profiles, who do have at least one registration in that time frame. To the right of that, we get the total number of opportunities. So how many events took place, total number of registrations. Again, turnstile. I had 1,120, so 1,120 people come through the door at some point for some event. Could have been one person 1,120 times. Could have been 222 people distributed across that. This number will also include bulk group registrations. So if you have, at least if we're including that in this report, I didn't run it that way in this particular scenario, but if you have, scenarios where you identify, this group is bringing 50 people, I don't know who any of them are, I don't want to know who any of them are, this number will still include that. If 50 people walk through the door, we would get that number here. And then the total number of hours, of course, is the full contribution based on that. So that's what these numbers represent when you are running reports. Now, again, there's a lot of different report types. It just depends on kind of what your preference is for, the highest level of sorting. Do you want to see a total by event name, by volunteer name, by group name, by interest category, by month? That would dictate which of these reports you'd like to run. One final thing before we move on to the volunteer side of reporting, you can create saved reports using this first report type, custom participation report. You can go through and generate queries that you'd like to use, select the detail level, include volunteer information or event information. And then once you've made all those selections, you can give yourself a report that you might run on a regular basis. Perhaps you generate like a monthly report or something. You could give this a title, make it private or shared. Shared means your other staff can also use this same report. But basically, this is just saving all the parameters we selected. So whenever we want to rerun that report, we come back in here, click on Load Saved Report Parameters, make that selection, set our date range, and then run the report. Okay, so the last thing that I want to show regarding reports, and then we'll get into some questions that have come in throughout this call. But the last thing I want to show is how volunteers can run their own report and actually how you can run the same report. So if we switch to the volunteer perspective, volunteers have a report management section. When they log into their account, they can view or print their activity history. And in this menu, they can set a date range. So kind of similar to how you might run reports, but they can set a date range, which means that they can also forecast hours. We'll get to that in a second here. But then they can select those events that popped up, and then down at the bottom, print their report or email themselves their report. If they email themselves their report, it's just going to send the PDF straight to the email that Service has on file with them. So if they want to go and do something with that later, perhaps just forward it to someone else. This is sometimes easier to do, but they can also print it directly. So if we click on Print Report, this will download a PDF immediately, and then that PDF, of course, could be printed. Now, this Activity Summary PDF is what it's titled, has letterhead up at the top in my database. Your system is different. You can have a logo here, you can have letterhead here. It is entirely up to you. What you would like to use here, you need to submit to our customer support team through a ticket. Let them know you want to use that as the PDF logo, and then they will upload that for you. So if you've not done this before, which hopefully you have, there is a button down at the bottom of the page to click Need Help whenever you're logged in. So if you click on that, doesn't matter what you type in here, you can click on Contact Us and then submit a ticket and attach your logo. Let them know you want to use that for your PDF logo. Okay, so you can see this report. Obviously, it has that letterhead. We can see who the report was run for, what date the report was run. And then, of course, we see all the contributions inside the date range that we searched, right? So we can see all of those things here. If any of the events or shifts that we selected are in the future, those will be listed as scheduled. If something is happening right now or has not concluded, that will be listed as pending. Anything that's scheduled or pending does not count towards the total. Now you can also see at the bottom of the report, there is a QR code and an option to create a verified copy of the report from a direct link. So this is something that, whomever this volunteer is, whomever they turn it into, that person could scan this QR code. That basically takes them to a verification tool, and it inputs the code automatically so they don't have to manually type it in. But then they can click Verify Report, and that will allow them to produce a verified copy of this report. It's basically the exact same thing, but if we go and look at that report, you can see that it just says official verified copy at the bottom. Otherwise, it is the same report. Okay, so again, volunteers can run this report themselves to get their hours, and then of course, turn that into someone. They have a verified copy. It can be helpful in cutting down on the things that you need to do. Just so you know, we do have a video that shows volunteers how to run that report themselves. If you would like to share that with people, you are more than welcome to. There's this video that has this For Volunteers banner. It says how to print your volunteer history. Okay, one last thing about that report, you can also run it. If we switch to the admin side, if you go into a volunteer's profile, you select an individual here. If you go to view their registrations, then from here, you can, again, set a date range, select those shifts, and then down here, print the summary as a PDF. This is that exact same report. If we open that up here, you can see it's the same format. It has the verification tool. So if you want to run this report, you can also do that for an individual. Okay, we're going to move into some questions here. So if you do continue to have those, please write those in. The first thing that was asked is regarding how hours are contributed or recorded when you are creating default credit hours for an event, or if you are contributing more hours on a service project or adjusting activity. How are we writing those in here, and what does the decimal mean? So this is a really good question, very important to note. This is always recorded in hours, not in minutes. So if I write 1.5, that is 90 minutes. It is an hour and a half, right? So if your event is from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., you would write this out as 1.5. Do not do 1.30. That is an hour and a third. It's closer to 1 hour and 20 minutes, right? So you don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you do this recorded in hours, not in minutes. Okay. Well, actually, it looks like that was the main question. So I'm sure there were a lot of questions that are unique to your organization. I do want to point out, as you have questions, as you're engaging the platform, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to serve you. When you are logged into your account, you can click on this Need Help button. If you type in a question or a topic through here, you'll see articles that have to do with that. If you like to have like step-by-step instructions, then this is a really helpful tool. Personally, I prefer to pop these out. I think they're easier to view as a separate page, but there's a lot of information in there. So this is a good tool in and of itself, but regardless what you have searched for, you can always click on Contact Us and then submit a ticket through here. If you write in your question, again, you can attach files, like if you're adding a logo or you want to update a logo, you can then submit that to our customer support team. They will get back to you right away. We have posted hours of Monday through Saturday, 8:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. Mountain Time. If you submit a ticket inside those times, you can typically expect a response very quickly. They'll get back to you right away. If it's outside those hours, just depends on when somebody next sees that. But please feel free to use this tool. And then, of course, we have a lot of other recorded webinars if you want to look through those. So I want to thank you again for joining today. We're grateful that we have so many people who are interested in learning more and utilizing the tool better. We would love to help you use the tool better as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know how we can serve you. We are delighted to be able to partner with all of you in all the different communities that you're serving in. So thank you again for your time here today. Hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday and that you're having a wonderful summer.